Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Bitter Pill, the show where we talk about bitter pills of truth that people would rather not swallow and the corporate media doesn't want you to know exist. So today I'm joined by Robbie Jaeger, who is an investigative journalist with the MCSC network, uh, focusing mainly, I think, Robbie, on financial corruption. Um,
Yep.
yeah, if you want to add anything to that brief
Oh no, yeah,
snippet.
sure,
Um,
yeah, no. I just do just I'm normally the political finance guy, right? But every once in a while, something comes across that I just have to follow that too, and it kind of
yeah,
gets out of my box, which is good, So don't want it's nice to have a niche, but you also got to kind of get outside of that every once in a while just to make sure that you still can. You don't
yeah,
want to get too rusty.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's all tied together, right? Corruption is
Yeah.
corruption. Um, I remember you. I think I first heard about you when you did a great piece during the Democratic primary, talking about who the big players were in the hit campaign on Tulsi Gabbard.
Mm. Yep. Yeah. There was a. And what's funny is that it's kind of you can also kind of tie them into another little super PAC type thing going on right now. It's the same people, or at least they're tied to the same people. But yeah, back there, Democratic primaries, I was doing a bunch of little finance pieces, and there was this big, the RussiaGate thing was super huge, right? And
Yeah.
there was a super PAC out there that just kind of formed out of nowhere and was putting out ads about Tulsi Gabbard, and it was just the lamest you know it was the Hillary Clinton, like somebody's working for Vladimir Putin, Russian asset type crap that was being said. It turns out that hey, the super that put out those ads was run by an ex Hillary campaign guy who's now making a bunch of money from, I'm not sure if you've heard of them. They're called Midas Touch. They
I
do a
haven't
little
heard of them.
podcast. Made a bunch of. They were like a Lincoln Project light through the election season. But yeah, now they're making. That's where all the money for that grift is going now. So the grift never stops. It's never not election season
Yeah,
for some of these folks.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, so, I was looking before uh, we came on at some of the reporting on this. Uh, well, let me back up. What I brought Robbie on to talk about mainly today was an oil spill that happened, or excuse me, uh, gasoline, refined gas spill
Mm-hmm.
uh, that happened last August in a pipeline in North Carolina. Well, actually, a pipeline that's all over the East Coast, but specifically the spill happened in North Carolina. And so I was doing a little bit of digging before we got on, looking for stories on it, and I didn't find much. You hardly any back then, other than some local news stories,
Right.
and not much since then. So,
Yeah.
uh,
So and then that's kind of that's why I've been kind of on this crusade about this story, right? Because okay, so here's what happened. Colonial Pipeline is the name of the pipeline. It's also the name of the company. Um, and a majority of this pipe, I mean, it started being built in the 60s, as we were talking about before the show. And, you know, it says 707 some odd miles that run through North Carolina. At least 88% of those miles of pipe were constructed prior to 1980. So they're at least 40 years old. Um,
wow.
so what happened basically is in August of 2020 there was a spill from the underground line right outside of Charlotte in a town called Huntersville, North Carolina, in a place called the Oler Nature Preserve, and basically just a large protected wooded area. It is a nature preserve, and it is at least a habitat to one special species, according to the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. So there is a habitat environmental impact here. which gets downplayed over and over again as the story progresses. And so the leak happened, and at first, Colonial Pipeline reported it to be, 63,000 gallons of gasoline. And it was no big deal, or at least, I mean, that's a big deal. It is obviously a big deal, but in the grand scheme of like media stories and stuff like that, sensationalism, 63,000 gallons of gasoline spilling into the ground isn't going to get too much attention. So fast forward a couple months later to November, state regulators are saying, "Hey, we think these estimates too low. Can we get another estimate?" Colonial Pipeline came back with, "Okay, so it wasn't 63,000 gallons. It was more like 250,000 gallons." And then they filed more filings that were basically saying that we've recovered around 250,000 gallons. And when it comes to oil spills and recovery rates, it's never like a 1-to-1 ratio type thing. You barely ever get back what you spilled. You're lucky to get back half in a lot of instances. And so state regulators again said, "Okay, we feel like these numbers are too small considering what you've recovered. We need more estimates." And finally, they came back in January, Colonial Pipeline did, with the estimate saying, "Okay, it wasn't 250,000 gallons. It was actually probably closer to 1.2 million gallons," which is automatically making it the largest pipeline spill in the last century. And if the estimates were to move up again, it would put it close to being one of the largest pipeline spills in U.S. history.
Do you mean the largest this century or the largest within the last 100 years?
I mean, it probably both. I mean, at this point, it's already the largest pipeline spill in North Carolina history.
Right. Yeah.
And the totals are close to being one of the largest gasoline pipeline spills in U.S. history.
Yeah.
Which is significant regardless of where the spill occurred.
Yeah.
Right? So Colonial Pipeline has made a point to be like, "Hey, it's happened on, it happened in a nature reserve, but we have the easement, so they kind of have, like, basically they're trying to say, well, it happened on our property. Nobody else's stuff got messed up. There's, you said the drinking water samples have come back clean, as has the EPA. The EPA has confirmed that. But here's the problem, is that there's still levels of benzene, and that's a cancer-causing agent that has been scientifically proven to cause leukemia and other illnesses if ingested either by drinking or inhaling a significant amount of the fumes. I mean, it's in cigarette smoke, so you can't inhale it, with in a gaseous form. But regardless of that, so it was at 4,000 some odd times the appropriate levels for groundwater. And there might not be people sitting down there drinking out of the groundwater, but there are animals, there's just wildlife, there's plant life, and and you're poisoning it. So here's where the first thing obviously is Colonial, completely undershot their estimates significantly over and over again, had to be pushed over and over again to finally just come out and say how much they think that they actually spilled. They downplayed it for months and months. But it's also the fact that, with the EPA, who I reached out to and asked if they had been investigating this Colonial Pipeline spill, they said basically, well, the drinking water wasn't contaminated, and the air quality in the surrounding area, wasn't terrible. So, they basically washed their hands of it, and they, kicked the can down to the state, to the state regulators, and then they rolled out. And to me, it's like, you're supposed to be the Environmental Protection Agency, right?
Yeah.
And it's hard to protect things after it's already been poisoned, right?
Yeah.
So unless you're going to come down hard on these pipeline companies that have pipelines that are 40, 50, 60 years old, springing leaks all over the place, well, you're not protecting the environment if you're allowing these companies to continue to have rickety pipes that are springing leaks all over the place. I mean, you have to incentivize them to do better, and unfortunately, that's just not happening. And my fear is that, I mean, it was bad enough that it led that all this stuff happened in a nature preserve, but what happens if it happens in, say, the San Francisco Bay, Because I think we all saw that footage of the Chevron facility a couple of weeks ago that leaked. It was like 600 gallons of oil into the San Francisco Bay, and it looked absolutely terrible. And as
Yeah.
terrible as it was, I asked, you know, about that being 600 gallons. Now imagine what 1.2 million gallons would look like.
Yeah.
It would be catastrophic.
Yeah.
And
600 gallons isn't much.
unless we come down on these companies and change the way we do things, both on a regulatory level and an enforcement level, it's going to happen again and again, and eventually it will happen into a major body of water. It's already happened, and it'll happen again until things change.
Yeah, it's such strange logic that the EPA gave you. It's like, oh well, yeah, we know that they murdered somebody, but it's nobody important. So
Right. I didn't understand that reasoning. They basically said, well, no person is going to be poisoned by, drinking their water. So there's really nothing to see here. And to me, it's like, I didn't know you were the People Protection Agency. I thought you were the Environmental Protection Agency.
right.
And I thought the point of you was to protect the environment. And as we all know, we've all heard the old saying, an ounce of prevention equals a pound of cure.
Right.
And that's true. And the best way to protect something is to prevent something bad from happening to it. You can't call yourself a protector and only show up after the damage has been done. That's kind of backwards to me. But there's a lot of different sides to this Colonial Pipeline story, and the first one is definitely on the company themselves, Colonial Pipeline, who, shocker, are owned by Koch Industries and Royal Dutch Shell and a couple of other companies.
Yeah.
So they have a 5,600 mile pipeline that runs through 16 states up and down the East Coast. It's like the largest mover of gasoline and fuel on the East Coast. And that was proven back in August of 2016. Or I don't know if it was August, but back in 2016, there was a giant explosion down in Birmingham, Alabama at the pipeline.
Right.
It was also Colonial Pipeline, and they shut the pipeline down for a couple of weeks. There was the gas price jumping up. Everybody remembers how high gas was, at least if you lived on the East Coast. And you may not remember why, but of course, it goes back to Colonial Pipeline, who since there's been 2,750 pipeline incidents or pipeline spills over the last 20 years. The Colonial Pipeline is responsible for 1 out of every 10, so around 272. In that same period of time, there's been 38 pipeline spills in North Carolina, and Colonial was responsible for 32 of them. So the spill in particular happened at the site of a repair made in 2004. There was a crack that had developed. Now, these pipelines check themselves. Well, they don't check themselves, but these companies check their pipelines with different tools that check for different things, right? So, my report that I reported on was basically I had come across some documents that had basically shown Colonial, while they may have been technically keeping up with standards and regulations, which is a completely separate conversation. The fact of the matter is that in 2019, Colonial Pipeline only checked it at the most 45% of their pipeline for any kind of anomalies, but they only checked like 909 miles for dents, corrosion, deformation, and they only checked 650 miles of the pipeline. 650 out of 5,600. All right, and that's the ratio that I'm trying to drive home. They checked 650 out of 5,600 miles of their pipeline for cracks.
That's
so
crazy.
It's kind of hard, and it's even worse. In 2018, in the year before, they only checked 150 miles for cracks. So between 2018 and 2019, they checked a total of 800 miles of their 5,600 mile pipeline for cracks. So it's kind of hard to stop or prevent a 1.2 million gallon gas leak stemming from a crack in your pipeline if you're not checking your pipeline for cracks.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, and as you
you
as
know,
you pointed out in the article, I mean, it was very unclear, like whether, for example, they were checking the same stretch of pipeline for different flaws, which would mean that
right.
you know a lot fewer miles of the pipeline was inspected, and when you just added up the figures that they gave for inspecting for different kinds of problems.
Yeah, and the way, and that's a way that the form is ambiguous, um, because there's a very specific numbers, and quite honestly, I've checked other pipeline companies and their reports, and I see the same doubling up of numbers in those top two spots on pretty much every report. Those spots being miles inspected by corrosion detection tools, and then miles inspected by dent or deformation tools. Usually, those mileage numbers down to the decimal are always the same, which would lead common sense to believe that it's the same tool used that inspecting that same stretch of pipe, just functioning in two different ways, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, but there's nothing on these reports that will basically identify if there was any unique miles, like how many unique miles of pipe, or did they just check the same stretch over and over again? So while it could be like 2,400 ish miles as their top end, I mean, it could be as low as like 980
Right. Right.
total, checked, and that's nowhere near enough. Whenever you're talking about a pipeline that is, 5,500 miles long,
Yeah.
and it's like, again, most of it is like 40 years old, and it's
Or
springing
more.
leaks everywhere, and that's evident also by the report. I mean, the report also shows you how many anomalies that they found over the course of that year, and it was like 300. There was like they found like 300 anomalies over the course of the year. They made 100 and I think it was like 180 some repairs. Compare that to the much shorter, but much more polarizing Dakota Access Pipeline. Right? They checked in 2019. They checked around 720, I think, 740 miles of their pipeline. They didn't check any of it for cracks, so that's concerning. But they checked about 700 miles of their pipeline for at least corrosion and stuff. They found one anomaly. Now that's not to say that that's not to say that Dakota Access is any better than Colonial.
They've
But
already
it's
had
also to say
accidents on that one, right?
Colonial Colonial checked about the same amount of miles, or maybe a little more, and found over 300 anomalies. And Dakota Access found one.
Yeah.
Which, and that's how Colonial Pipeline is falling apart.
Yeah.
They know it's falling apart. Regulators know it's falling apart. There's another stat I come to. It was like Colonial Pipeline's done like $58 million in property damage over the last 3 years, since 2017,
Wow.
and $24 million of property damage at least is stemming from the incident in question in North Carolina, and it's just going to happen again and again and again. Today, they actually released their 2020 financials as a company just a couple days ago. I reported on those today. They made $1.3 billion last year, which was only, but they made more profit. They made 480 millions in profit for 2020, and they have 116 million dollars tied up in legal, regulatory, and environmental contingencies. So and stemming from 40 incidents, like they still owe 116 million dollars in fines from 40 separate incidents.
Wow.
But it's like, it's no big deal. Like the regulatory bodies just don't care, and they just keep letting Colonial Pipeline do this over and over and over again.
So wait a minute. Something you said kind of caught my attention. You said this incident that they're claiming, oh, nothing to worry about. It happened out in the middle of nowhere. Did $24 million so far in property damage?
Yeah, that's $24 million in property damage to the nature preserve, right? And and also the cleanup is costing quite a bit of money for Colonial. They've already had to buy at least 3 people out of their homes because of the cleanup effort, which could take. I mean, they don't know. In their report today, they came out and said, "Hey, we still don't know how long it's going to take to finish cleaning up. We still don't know how much it's going to cost in the end. What's our grand total of damage that we've done?" And they still don't know if there's going to be any fines coming down the pipeline. No pun intended. They still don't know any of these things. They're speculating that the cleanup could take a couple of years on maximum. They're still down there. They're still down there cleaning up now, but they're treating they treat the cleanup site like a crime scene. There were some reporters that I kind of was working kind of with behind the scenes, a local news station outside of Charlotte, and they finally got to tour the grounds, but it was very like a guided tour. You weren't allowed to wander. There wasn't really like Mecklenburg County officials have said that Colonial Pipeline has been has been forthcoming with what they have asked for them, but they've also said that we're not really involved that much. But and I feel like every agency I've spoken to has kind of taken that same thing. They're like, I've asked them all the same questions. Hey, is Colonial working with you? Are they being cooperative? Are they giving you all the information you're requesting in a timely manner? This, that, and the third. And they're all like, I mean, yeah, but we're not really involved like that. You have to ask this bureaucracy. So I'll ask them, and they'll say, yeah, well, I mean, but we're not really too involved in that. You're going to have to ask these guys. And they just keep kicking the can around, which is frustrating.
Yeah.
But then you start to realize that, the reason why we're in this mess is because basically the industry writes the rules.
Right.
The American Petroleum Institute basically wrote all of the regulations that the Department of Transportation's governing body for pipelines, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, they use by order of Congress, because the law basically says to use industry standards in place of basically the governing body or regulators inventing their own standards. Congress would rather them use industry standards whenever possible, and the oil industry is more than happy to make their own rules, and they do that. And of course, not only does Colonial Pipeline play a major role, out at the American Petroleum Institute, and their vice president, Angela Kohler, actually sits on a very prominent committee there. But the same vice president, Mrs. Kohler, for Colonial Pipeline, also sits on PHMSA, the Pipeline Hazardous Material Administration. She sits, like, a member of Colonial Pipeline literally sits on their rules advisory committee. So
yeah,
the regulators are basically at the mercy of the industry, and the industry has no intention of policing themselves.
Yeah, and the people who are supposedly doing the regulating typically are from the industry. It seems to typically work that way with environmental regulation. I remember, for when I first got involved with environmental issues, I guess Reagan had just become president, but I was reading a book about environmental regulation under Carter, and even under Jimmy Carter, there was this revolving door where everybody, it was the fox guarding the chicken coop, regardless of which administration's in power. And I remember when the Deepwater Horizon explosion happened, the oil rig off the Gulf Coast blew up, and largest environmental disaster in U.S. history happened under the Obama administration, and it's hardly ever talked about because it happened under a Democratic president. But I mean, like you said, nothing changed as far as how the oil rigs were regulated when Obama came in. Neither Obama, the Obama administration, nor the Bush administration really wrote the rules. It's
No,
industry. Um,
right. You know, and that's the other side of the coin. When we can talk all day about Colonials as a company, their negligence and their bare minimum. I mean, even in 2019, when the latest inspection was like a 63-day on-site inspection done by PIMSA, and they have found that there was a bunch of procedural stuff. You didn't have a safety valve here. You didn't have that here. But the one thing that really got to me was that PIMSA themselves basically said, "Hey, Colonial, you're not keeping your inspection records properly. You're supposed to be keeping, a very detailed written inspection log for every single inspection that you make, and especially when it came to things of like corrosion, they weren't keeping those records properly. There was certain sections of pipe that crossed under navigable waterways that standards would suggest that you pay more scrutiny to. Basically, they were going 5, 6, sometimes 8, 11 months past their inspection dates. And then Colonial was just getting a slap on the wrist, getting a strongly worded letter.
yeah.
And that's the other side. Like I said, we can talk about Colonial's negligence and their failure or just barely being able to meet the already bare bones and bare minimum expectations that the government has of them. But that's the thing, is that the government has these bare minimum expectations or regulations or industry standards written by the same people that continuously ignore their own. And this is a thing. This is how big of a joke the American Petroleum Institute is. I mean, they're nothing new. Obviously, they've been around forever. They're the largest lobbyist of oil companies in the country by far. Every major oil, gas, pipeline company is a member of them. They're massive. They're huge. They're very powerful. They're also a very big joke because they awarded Colonial Pipeline in 2019. Well, they awarded them in early 2020, but the award was for 2019, the year where they checked only 650 miles of their pipe for cracks and found 305 anomalies in the pipeline. They awarded them with their biggest safety award for their, they award for their dedication to inspecting and pushing the envelope for safety. And then this happens because it's a total joke. And regulators, and you're right, whenever you reference how we've been having these problems, and obviously the Obama years, they didn't do anything. The Bush years, obviously they're not going to do anything. Clinton didn't care. And this has been something that's been kicked down the road. We were talking about how these pipelines were built like in the 60s, and that's about the last time that our government paid them any real attention. And it's starting. We're paying the price for that now.
Yeah.
Because,
Yeah, I just wanted to fill in some details about Petroleum Institute's award because this is kind of hilarious. So at the same time that they're having all these different spills, Colonial received it was around 2000, the American Petroleum Institute's Distinguished Environmental and Safety Award for 4 consecutive years, 1999 to 2002. Some of these awards were made after EPA had filed a complaint against the company for violations of the Clean Water Act and prior to the landmark civil penalty assessed in the settlement of a civil case.
Oh, yeah.
Unbelievable.
Well, that was because back in 1996, Colonial Pipeline leaked a shit ton of oil into the Reedy River in South Carolina. And the EPA, for one of their rare instances of actually having to do something, they fined them like $34 million. But here's the thing that they don't tell you, is that according to Colonial Pipeline's financial reports, and, I'm sure that this policy was maybe a bit smaller back in 1996, but as of 2020, Colonial Pipeline is insured for like up to $30 million in damage from leaks and anything they do to the environment and stuff like that. So, as long as the bill comes in under $30 million, they don't really care. I mean, they're insured, and and that's the thing is we need complete overhaul uh, of the regulatory system. If because look, and this is what I've been saying on every show I've gone on is that in a perfect world I would say no pipelines.
Yeah.
Um, in the world we live in, I would say no new pipelines.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that's something that we can actually do. Unfortunately the reality of our world in the capitalist society is that the oil industry is the cornerstone of that, and as much as we would love to get away from it, which I do think is possible, but it's going to take an actual serious effort by our government that we're not getting. Um, but that's a different discussion. But you can't just end it. You can't just cut it off and yank it away, right? Because it would cause a system shock to the world, not just our economy, but to the global economy.
Right.
But you can say no new pipelines, and you can say, hey, all you people that have existing pipelines, things are about to change. If you want to pull in money hand over fist with these pipelines, you can't just have them slapped together with duct tape and Bondo and think that that's okay. We're going to make you check your entire, I don't care if you've got a 500-mile pipeline or a 5,500-mile pipeline. You have to check all of it every year. You have to check all of it with every tool. And that's another thing. In any 1 year since 2004, Colonial Pipeline has not checked more than 30% of their entire pipeline with more than one tool. That is to say that no matter how much they've checked their pipeline, they've never checked more than 30% of it in a year for cracks, or they've never checked more than 30% of it in a year for dents or corrosion. So, that's simply just that. And even though that meets regulation and that satisfies PHMSA and it satisfies the EPA, it's not good enough because they continuously have these issues. 60 incidents in the last 3 years for Colonial Pipeline, $58 million in property damage. I'm not sure if that's award worthy, but I do know that it's scrutiny worthy, and it definitely needs more attention. I mean, I think Colonial Pipeline honestly needs to be sitting down in front of Congress and explaining themselves why a multi-billion-dollar pipeline has accidents at the same frequency or maybe at a greater frequency than your average forklift operator. I don't see how that makes any sense in the world at all, and our politicians continue to ignore the problem. They look, Pete Buttigieg, this is his problem now. He's the Secretary of Transportation. PHMSA falls underneath the DOT. Okay. If he wanted to, he could rewrite these rules. He could clean house at PHMSA, restructure it, put in new people. He could rewrite the rules, or he could form a committee to have the rules rewritten. This is all stuff he could do.
Yeah.
Is he going to do it? Probably not.
Yeah.
But the time is now.
I mean, in the world of the possible, like we're years away from Green New Deal or anything like that. Are there other countries that are doing better that you know of? I mean, capitalism's capitalism, but is it this disastrous everywhere?
Oh, I mean, as far as the pipeline game goes, but
yeah.
I mean, maybe. It's hard enough to keep track of all of the crap going on here.
Yeah.
I do know that instead of seriously looking at DAPL or seriously looking at Colonial Pipeline, that our government has been spending an inordinate amount of time looking at the merits of Russia's new pipeline project that they're trying to do. Basically saying, we're going to take another look at it, and then they took another look at it, and then they say, well, we'll allow it to proceed for now, as if they have any right to stop it in the first place. But, and that's the thing, the attention is never where it needs to be. I talked, when I first broke this story, it was like, okay, I'm not expecting everything I release to go viral. And I'm not really always expecting, something going on in a little, podunk county outside of Charlotte, North Carolina to make national news, but it's a massive incident. And and once I show everybody that the reason why these things keep happening is because there's nothing there to prevent them from happening because nobody's checking them to prevent them from happening. Um, and I figured at least I could get some support from like the local chapters of Sunrise Movement. Well, that's a whole long story, right? But I was maybe not them specifically, but I was hoping that, hey, if I get this message out there, I might be able to get some attention from someone who could actually say something, and bring some attention, right?
Yeah.
And of course, I get hit up by Sunrise Movement Los Angeles and Sunrise Movement from Durham, North Carolina, and they're like, hey, send us this information. Let's organize. Let's do this. This,
Okay.
let's get some attention to it. So I did. I sent them the information that I had. I sent them my report and all my notes. Well, most of my notes that I had at the time. Um, and nothing. I've heard absolutely nothing. This was weeks ago. I've seen nothing from them. I've heard nothing from them. But they have taken the time to retweet Mark Ruffalo's video of him jogging through the woods and urging Biden to shut down the Dakota Access Pipeline, which, sure, that's a good thing and all, but Dakota Access Pipeline isn't leaking gasoline all over the East Coast at an astounding rate. And the Dakota Access Pipeline, it's that's the thing, is that Dakota Access is an easy one to talk about. It's an easy thing to politicize, especially if you're a Democrat. Because of the tribal land disputes.
Yeah.
It's easy for celebrities to get out there in front of it and, stick up for that and get some positive attention and everything. But, and as bad as DAPL is, and I really hope that we eventually can, get rid of it before it's really too late, before it gets too ingrained, which I fear it may already be. The problem's on the other coast, right? The problem is the one that, like I said, it springs leaks all up and down the East Coast. And they've got the government in a vice grip because they know that you can't shut it down or else your gas prices are going to jump to like $8 a gallon up and down the East Coast. So they feel like they can kind of just get away with it. And to a certain extent, they do and they have. And that's the problem that I want to get out there. I need like my idea is to use reporting, get this story out there, and best case scenario, have a public pressure campaign built. I'm not expecting to get AOC's attention. I'm not expecting any of the Justice Democrats or anybody in the Democratic Party. This is going to have to be something that's done with actual grassroots activists, not Greenpeace or Sunrise Movement or Sierra Club or any of those worthless nonprofits that literally just soak up money that could be going to actual organizations and groups that could be actually doing good. It's not going to come from an AOC or Ed Markey or or even a Bernie Sanders because they don't care, right?
So just to be clear, none of these people, none of the politicians, none of those environmental groups you mentioned have said a word about this at all.
Nope. Okay. Here's
except for Bill McKibben, I did see that after you got on him.
Man. Oh man. Look. Okay. Here's the thing. I wasn't the one to reach out to Bill McKibben. His group 350 is supposedly one of these big environmental groups that's supposed to care about stuff like this. But Misty over with Jesse over at Facts on the Ground actually pointed out my article to Bill McKibben.
Oh, okay.
And Bill McKibben said that he would try to write about it in his article in the New Yorker the following week. So fast forward to the next week, Bill McKibben writes his article, and of course, it's about what's going on in Texas at the time, which I understand.
Right.
But then at the very bottom of this really lengthy article, he literally writes 2 sentences about it and then just moves on. Right, the biggest pipeline spill to happen in the last century, and it's worthy of a footnote in one of your articles that was completely unrelated to it, and that was like, okay, so I guess you technically did what you said you would do, thanks for that. And he had he liked a response to that tweet, but he never actually like engaged with me about it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of like, really, I mean, if that's all that you find this story to be worth, is two sentences at the bottom of a 1,500 word essay about Texas. You don't find it. You obviously don't find this story relevant. And I don't understand why. And that's the thing, is that unless there's some kind of public push now to fix the regulations and to actually be serious about pipeline safety, um, what happened in North Carolina is going to happen again somewhere else. It's going to flood a million gallons of whatever oil, gas into the Mississippi River. It's going to bust a pipe, and it's going to leak a bunch of oil or gas into the Hudson. It's going to happen over on the West Coast. But you notice when it happened on the West Coast, whenever that Chevron
Right.
facility leaked, that oh man, they were all over it.
Yeah.
Everybody was all over that, and and that's the thing. And I was actually saying that to Misty the day before the Chevron incident happened. I told them that when it happens in California, that's when they'll care.
Yep.
And
Yep.
sure enough, very next day, Chevron spill happens. It's national news, and everybody cares.
Uh-huh.
And it baffles my mind. It was like,
So that we're talking about 1/2000th of the amount
yeah,
of stuff that's spilled in
yeah.
North Carolina.
I mean, hey, and but like I said, it's not a flashy story in North Carolina, right?
Yeah.
There's not a bunch of drinking water that's been contaminated. There's no tribal land dispute. It's just a really sketchy company that has been doing really dirty business and neglecting their product and their pipeline for years. And it's also a story of how the government's been letting them get away with it for that exact same amount of time, and they just go hand in hand with one another. And it's kind of it feels like an impossible battle,
Yeah.
but we'll never know if we can win it unless we make it, unless we get some public pressure. Right, the
Do you have
politicians
any
won't care.
ideas how to make that
Yeah, I mean,
happen?
exactly. And that's why I'm going anywhere that will have me, that wants
Yeah.
to talk about it.
Yeah.
And that's it though. I mean, politicians won't care. Like the politicians that could make a difference, like the AOCs, the Bernie Sanders, the politicians that, if they were to say something about it, would make it a national story just by them speaking about it. Right?
Right.
They won't care unless they know that we care.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Because we're the ones that are voting for them, right? And we're the ones that are making them popular. We're the reason, like, they, to an extent, like, okay, we all know how politics works. They're gonna say whatever they need to say to get you to give them what they want, which is your vote, right?
Right.
And we saw this with Biden and his $2,000 checks, with Warnock and Ossoff and the $2,000 checks that we're still waiting on. But regardless of that, is that we know, obviously, but they also know that they have to keep you around, right? They have to say the right things, and they won't care unless they know that we care. So until an AOC or Bernie Sanders or even an Ed Markey isn't going to say anything until enough of us beat down their door about it, telling them that this is a problem. Because while they may know that it's a problem, they just don't. A lot of them just don't see how does it benefit me? Like,
Right.
I'm Ed
Right.
Markey. How does it benefit me to worry about this pipeline in North Carolina when all the celebrity attention is on Dapple? And
Yeah.
that's where they feel like they need to be. They need to be hanging out with the Mark Ruffalos of the world, taking pictures, saying, no Dapple, shut it down. And it's like, okay, that's all well and good, but you're doing this for clicks. You could actually be doing some real good right now, breathing down Colonial Pipeline's neck, because we actually really need some help out here.
Yeah.
And it's just and it's just not the case. And so I'm just saying, okay, screw the politicians, screw the so-called activists. They're not helping. Media isn't talking about it other than the on-the-ground stuff going on locally. So I'm trying to just raise awareness of the story. I'm trying to get some indie progressive media with bigger followings than I have to take an interest in the story and try to get some attention put on there. and just build a bit of a movement. If it's not just for North Carolina and not just to go against Colonial, it's, because enough is enough, and we have to stop it somehow. We have to change things, and now is the perfect time. If Democrats that say that they care about the environment want to actually make some actual, possible, and substantial changes, lasting changes to the way that the pipeline industry and the oil industry work in our country, the time is now. These regulations can pass through with Democratic-controlled Congress and executive branch if they wanted to. But they have to know that, unfortunately, they won't just do it on their own virtue. They're going to have to know that they can gain something from it. And that's what's holding all this up, is that they just don't care. But this is something we can actually do to help the environment for a very long time if we actually get it done. And that's what I want. I try to stay out. I mean, I'm a reporter. I'm a journalist. I try to keep things even keel, right? But there are some issues that there needs to be some kind of activist element to it. And this is something that's worthwhile to me, because we're just letting these people just destroy our planet, and we're not punishing them for it. We're not incentivizing them to do better, and we need to change that, and we can change that, but we got to get some attention on it first.
Yeah. It's are there any local elected officials, like Mecklenburg County folks that are doing or saying anything about it?
I've reached out to some officials in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, and like I said, they kept it short and sweet, right? They said, yes, Colonial Pipeline has handed over whatever we've asked for, but we haven't really asked for that much because we're not overseeing the cleanup, and we don't oversee enforcement, we don't oversee regulations. Mecklenburg County is basically only involved in this ordeal so far as somebody needs to let them know that we're going to be digging a hole in your backyard. Basically, hey, we spilled something on your land. We're going to need your permission to come clean it up. Mecklenburg says, okay, go clean it up. And then Colonial says, all right, cool, we'll let you know when we're done. And that's pretty much all their involvement. Wow. Most of the regulatory involvement is going to come from the North Carolina State Regulatory Agency, the Department of Environmental Quality, who at the moment are reviewing Colonial's gigantic report that they called a comprehensive site assessment. Basically details all of the scientific stuff for the DEQ, and then they're going to basically get back to Colonial Pipeline and say, okay, judging by your assessment, this is what we expect as far as cleanup, and you have this amount of time to comply with this, and if you don't, there'll be fines, etc., etc. And also, DEQ and PIMSA is the agency to watch here, because they're the body that's going to be handing out the fines if there was any kind of safety violations, which there has to have been. I mean, Colonial Pipeline said that they have got the state-of-the-art technology that can do this and that when it comes to inspections, but then they also turned around and said that, well, the leak could have been happening for days or for months because the crack happened. The crack was so small that our technology couldn't detect it, which to me screams that your technology is inadequate. If that's the case, I mean, you make $480 million in net revenue a year, and you're telling me that you can't discover an anomaly in your pipeline that's leaking for days or weeks,
and leaking over 1 million gallons.
Right, and these two kids biking through the preserve smell. These are the guys. Look, and they said, "Oh well, we performed an aerial patrol over the area a couple of days before the leak was reported, and we didn't see anything." That's their fancy way of saying we flew a drone over it, and we didn't see any dead vegetation, so we thought things were okay.
So how exactly was it discovered?
It was discovered by a couple of teenagers biking through there on their bicycles, and they smelled a very strong, whiff of gasoline. Mm-hmm. And they reported it to to the park authorities, and then park authorities checked it out, and then immediately, Colonial said that they had the pipeline shut down in 5 minutes, and then they had the crack repaired within 5 days, and which is all well and good, but you let the crack fester for days, maybe weeks, maybe months, and like I said, it's hard to find cracks in your pipeline if you're only checking like 11% of it in a year. For cracks in the first place. I mean, I don't want to hear. I hate hearing how they say, "Well, we comply with all standards and safety." You're doing the bare minimum, and you're getting results. You're getting the appropriate results from someone that does the bare minimum. You're going to get bare minimum.
Not even
results.
doing the bare minimum. It sounds like.
Yeah, it's atrocious.
Yeah.
It's one of the oldest, ricketiest pipelines in the country. It's falling apart, and what it is, it's like this. Look at DAPL, look at Enbridge, right? Look at these massive pipelines. Now look at Colonial, and as bad as these other big pipelines are, like I said, DAPL is terrible. They checked just over half of it in 2019. They only found one problem. It's new, granted, but they only found one problem.
Mm-hmm.
They checked just a little bit more than that of Colonial, found 305 problems. And just the stretch that they checked. So just imagine all the problems that they didn't catch. 55 some odd % that they didn't check. That's scary, right? And so whenever you look at DAPL, you compare it to Colonial and say, hey, you think it's bad now. It's basically looking at itself in the mirror 40 years into the future.
Exactly.
This is what your future is going to look like, right? It's like you're looking at, you got your girl, and then you've got your girl's mom, right? And you're like, oh God, right? So, but no, in all seriousness, I mean, that's the thing. We can stop it now. We can deal with Colonial Pipeline now and use what we've done, use our solutions that we work out with Colonial, and how to handle that situation. We can apply them to the newer pipelines out west, right? And hopefully prevent any $1.2 million leaks from happening into the San Francisco Bay or into the Gulf of Mexico or, into, a bunch of farmland, and that's the thing is that, these things can happen in red states and nobody's going to care. Right. Which is just, it should get the same amount of attention. And if it happens in a blue state, God forbid. And it's terrible regardless. It should be a story regardless. But we can actually, we can save DAPL. I'm not saying save it for like we can keep using it, right? But we can, we can prevent DAPL from becoming Colonial Pipeline if we deal with Colonial Pipeline now. If we don't deal with Colonial Pipeline, not only are we going to have a Colonial Pipeline springing leaks everywhere up and down the East Coast, but 20 years from now, we're going to have Colonial Pipeline springing leaks, and we're going to have DAPL springing leaks, and we're going to have the Enbridge line springing leaks, and it's just going to, and we're really going to be in a tough spot then, and it's just going to be a bunch of us sitting back in our chairs, throwing our hands up, saying, "Hey, we've been trying to tell you this for years that you've kicked the can down the road too far, and now it's almost like there's no going. It's almost like there's no going back, but it's not too late to go back. We can fix it." But like I said, it's just going to take a lot of stuff. It's going to take a movement. It's going to take public pressure.
Yeah, well, it's hard to have that if people don't even know about it. It's so frustrating.
Right.
I mean, like, all that I know of as far as so-called environmental activists talk about this is after somebody leaned on it, Bill McKibben finally wrote a paragraph about it.
Yeah.
Oh, jeez.
Thanks, Bill.
I didn't have time to look through this, but I saw in your Twitter feed you had dug into some more developments with the corruption with Colonial. I didn't really have time to. So, is there anything new happening since you first started going on people's shows about this?
So, not too much new has come out. Like I said, today I briefly tweeted about Colonial Pipeline's new financial report that they released. Previously, at the time of my other report just a few weeks ago, they had only released their financials through quarter 3 of 2020, and on the 15th of this month, so I guess a few days ago, they released their full 2020 financials. Well, I'm not sure if that's the day they released it, but that's the date on the file, right? So it might have taken a few extra days for them to actually upload it to the website. But yeah, so that's all it was. Basically basically just reporting things we kind of already had an idea of. Final. It's interesting to see, how much money they make in profit. How much money they made. I mean, the coronavirus killed a lot of businesses, but it didn't really hurt Colonial Pipeline that much. Their profit or their total income only went down by 3%. But on the other hand, their profit margin went up by 3%. So their total money went down by 3%. Their profit went up by 3%. They still owe $116 million in fines from 40 different incidents over the last few years. They are insured till about $30 million when it comes to environmental damages and stuff like that. And they still, like I said, and that's what I wanted to see, because that's the most updated report from either Colonial or any of the regulators, is that financial report that they released. And in it, I was hoping to find maybe a little more insight as to how the investigations into the spill are going, but it seems Colonial chose either not to say or to be very vague. Like, again, they said in their latest financial report that the investigations and the cleanup are still ongoing. They don't know how much it's going to wind up costing in the end, and they don't know if there's going to be any fines coming down. So we're still waiting and seeing. It's a very slow process. I know for a fact that the file that they submitted to the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality was very large. It was like 1,600 pages. It involved a lot of aerial photographs, and lots of scientific data as far as water, chemistry, stuff like that. So it could be a while before the DEQ, because here's the thing: Colonial Pipeline has like I said, they make $1.3 billion a year. The North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, their budget for the entire year is $80 million. So they're the ones that are in charge of looking after Colonial Pipeline right now. So there is no timeline. I've spoken to people from the DEQ. They don't have a timeline as to when their assessment of Colonial's report will be complete. So it is a developing story. It's just one of those things. We're gonna have to check in with the DEQ and their website. Have to check in with PIMSA and their website and their database every day, just to see if there's been any new filings or any new paperwork, uploaded to the system. So, as far as that, there's no timetable for any kind of results or any kind of fines or anything, and it's just one of those slow trickles of information that, someday soon they'll announce something or they'll file something, and, I'll announce it when I find it. But, stay tuned, I guess, because it could be a while, or it could be tomorrow. We really don't know.
Yeah. Is there any final words you want to leave people with about this story, or just
Sure. Yeah, so I'd like to thank you for having me on, first and foremost. I'm glad you reached out to me and got in touch. And I really do appreciate you sharing your time and your platform with me, because I always appreciate that, for sure.
Absolutely.
This story is an important story, I feel like. That's why I'm pushing it so hard. I'm trying to get out and raise awareness. So I encourage any of your viewers that want to learn more about it. You can, go to my Twitter. That's a lot of what's going on my Twitter feed right now. It involves that. Also read my article, but there's also a lot of good work being done by, some local journalists and local news stations in Charlotte that I'm sure. NC Policy Watch is another good outlet to find more information about the story. You can find me on Twitter and on Rockfin at RobletOFire, ROBLETOFire. And basically, my closing words that I like to leave everybody with: any of your viewers get a few minutes of free time, spare time over the course of their night. Maybe they get bored and want to do something. Take 5 to 10 minutes and perhaps read some literature or something about autism and its specifically its effect on children, just so we can build a more inclusive and educated world for all of our neurodivergent brothers and sisters out there, and take it one day at a time, and hopefully we can make this world a better place.
All right. Well, thank you so much for um, your time, Robbie. It's great to have you on, and I will put all the info that Robbie just gave us about where to find him and so forth in the description of the video. And again, thank you so much for coming on, Robbie.
Thank you.